Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks all of you for being here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to be here and speak to you guys, and it's because of you guys and people who subscribe to the New American Magazine that I actually get the opportunity to spend all day, every day researching, and it's because of that that I can be here and tell you guys about some of the things that I've learned over the years. So I'm going to talk to you guys about the United Nations and a couple of things linked to the United Nations. Obviously, we can't do everything. I could literally drag this presentation on for a week, but you guys would probably get bored of me after an hour. So we'll try to keep it to an hour. And I'm going to focus on the UN threat to the United States and to our freedom. There's a lot of other elements of the UN I could get into, and we'll touch on a few of them. And some of the stuff we're just going to be going through really fast. If you want more information, almost everything that I'm going to cover in this presentation today you can find in extended form at thenewamerican.com. So if you go to the website, www.thenewamerican.com, there's a little search function there. If I say something tonight that interests you, just go to that search function, type it in there, you'll find more, or you can come talk to me afterwards, and I'll be happy to point you in the right direction. So we'll talk a little bit about the UN's history and the goals of the United Nations, the UN's involvement in education. Believe it or not, the UN really is involved in education, and people probably think that's really weird, right? It's bad enough that our local school board is doing what they're doing. Now we need the UN to work on it. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Then we have the UN climate hoax. They're pushing this idea that our carbon emissions, literally the gas we exhale, is this kind of deadly pollution that's going to cook the planet. And so we need to pay tax on it, believe it or not. And they have this phrase they call sustainable development. And it sounds nice. I'm sure they had a focus group and they figured out that this phrase sounded nice and non-threatening. But it is very threatening, and we'll talk about why. They have the UN Agenda 2030. We'll talk about that too. It's basically, they're calling it now the Declaration of Interdependence. So the Declaration of Independence was the start of our nation. And now the UN has their Declaration of Interdependence, and it's for we the peoples, they say. So we'll talk about that and what's inside of it. The UN's fake human rights agenda. I put human rights in quotes for a reason. It's not because I don't like human rights. It's because what the UN considers human rights is the opposite of human rights. It's the opposite of what we in the United States have cherished as rights and what's enshrined in our Constitution. We'll talk just a little bit about some of the UN assaults on the United States. Just most recently, the UN human rights chief, he's a prince from Jordan, Islamic dictatorship. He said that international law requires robust gun control in the United States. There was the jihad attack in Orlando, and he came out and said that international law requires gun control in the United States. And then we'll talk about what we can do about all this, because it's a big problem, but we won't go away without anything to do. So what's the history of the UN? Where did this come from? Well, after World War I, they tried. They had this League of Nations idea, and that flopped because the U.S. Senate said no, quite wisely in my opinion. And after World War II, they came back again with the United Nations. So it was a new organization with a new charter, and there was a couple of key people involved in the founding. And this is something they won't really teach very often in the public schools or in the history books even. So who was behind this? Well, we had Stalin on one side, right, the butcher, the mass murderer, one of the worst mass murderers of human history, killed tens of millions of people. And on the other side, we had our representative, Alger Hiss, and he was so important he got to be the Secretary General of the founding conference. So he was the first Secretary General of the UN. There you can see his picture. It's actually his mugshot. He ended up being convicted of perjury because he lied about his espionage activities. He was a spy for the Soviet Union, the same mass murdering butcher that we just discussed before, Stalin. So there you have the founders of the United Nations. Now, do you suppose they had your freedom in mind when they set up this organization? They definitely did not, right? They definitely did not, and I think it's very clear. So you don't hear much about Alger Hiss anymore, even though he was the first Secretary General of the UN. He was really the single most important person involved in this founding conference that created the UN, and he was a Soviet spy. So that kind of lays the foundation here for everything that comes later, and I think everything that the UN has done since then makes more sense when you understand where it came from. Here's John Foster Dulles. He eventually became Secretary of State, but he wrote this before he got that high job. He did participate in San Francisco at the conference that founded the United Nations, and he said in his book, War or Peace, that the UN represents not a final stage in the development of world order, but only a primitive stage. So therefore, its primary task is to create the conditions which will make it possible, a more highly developed organization. And he says, I've never seen a proposal made for collective security with teeth in it, and by teeth they mean force, right? The ability to coerce you into doing things, or even coerce nations, that could not, or for world government or for world federation, which could not be carried out either by the United Nations or under the United Nations Charter. So this isn't quite the harmless peace organization that we were told, right? He says right here that under the UN Charter, this could become a world government. And that's the idea, right? In 1945, it was the primitive stage, but we've advanced from there. And clearly, as we'll see from what the UN is doing today, that's what they have in mind. So a little bit of a history behind the UN atrocities. And here's another subject I could go on for days, because I write about this very frequently. It's, it's beyond tragic what happens. And if you go on thenewamerican.com, you'll find a lot of articles about it. But we can start back in 1960 in one of the earliest UN so-called peace missions. And the fact that they call it a peace mission or a peacekeeping mission is the most Orwellian thing I've ever heard. It's the opposite of that. It's a war mission. They're sending in armed troops with heavy machine guns and gunships and helicopters to kill people. And so we can look at one of their earliest peace missions in 1960. It's a really long story. There's a great documentary about it. I highly recommend it. It was actually produced by the John Birch Society, and it was this documentary that caused me to wake up and contact the JBS and ask for more information, and that kind of set me off on a decade of research to learn all the things that I've learned about the UN. But you had basically a communist dictator had taken over, and one province in what today is called the Congo, and one province there, they were pretty wealthy, it was pretty stable, they were doing well. They didn't want a communist dictator, so they said, we're going to just become our own province, we'll declare independence, and they called themselves the state of Katanga. And the UN did not like that. They thought that was a bad idea, so they called a meeting, and they decided to send in one of these wonderful peace forces, right? Troops from all over the place. And the story is so atrocious. I mean, don't believe me. Go watch the documentary. Go research it for yourself. They bombed hospitals. They murdered and raped children. They bayoneted 6-year-old kids. They murdered hospital workers. They bombed ambulances on purpose. The hospital was marked with a giant red cross on the top, and the UN planes shot it up full of machine guns and killed the people who were in there, including children who had been bayoneted previously by these UN troops. So this was not a peace mission, it was a war mission, and it was a war mission to force these people to submit to a communist dictator. So this is where the UN is coming from. Now, again, this you won't find in your government school textbooks, right? This has kind of been erased from history, but there it is, that you can see the testimony from the Red Cross workers, from the people who were there and witnessed this firsthand. Since then, we've had basically a non-stop parade of this kind of junk from the UN. Anywhere you look where they've been involved, whether it's in Africa or in Europe or in Asia or in the Americas, you find them raping children, killing protesters, doing anything they feel like it, all over the place. I've got a few examples here. This was pretty recent, in 2011. Very few publications wrote about this, but it was just so shocking. I thought it would be one of the examples that I would talk about. There was an election in the Ivory Coast, and the Christian president won the election, and there was a Muslim opponent who disagreed with that, and so he complained to the UN. He was a central banker, and he said, no, I don't agree with the election results, so he went to the UN. It went to the Supreme Court of the country. The Supreme Court said, no, the Christian won the election fair and square. That's the end of the story. The UN still didn't agree with that. So with support from Obama and others from the West, they backed these Muslim militias from the north of the country. They slaughtered thousands of Christians, and they installed the Muslim central banker as president, and they jailed the Christian president. So that's the UN Peace Force for you. They did a 2006 survey, Save the Children. It's actually not even that great of an organization. It's a nice name, but they did a survey of a town in the Ivory Coast. And 4 out of 5 underage girls there admitted to being regularly raped and sexually abused by these UN peacekeepers. So, we shouldn't call them peacekeepers. They're not peacekeepers. Just most recently in Haiti, we have 30,000 people dead, conservative estimate, from cholera spread by these UN peace troops because they weren't taking care for their sanitation. Who knows whether it was on purpose or not? Plenty of people think it was. Maybe it wasn't. Who knows? But what's been going on beyond that is atrocious, too. One of the stories there that's going to stick with me forever, they kidnapped an 8-year-old boy. these UN troops. It was actually a contingent from Pakistan, mentally challenged 8-year-old boy. They raped him for 5 years. And when somebody in the United States found out, they sent investigators down. Then these UN peacekeeping troops hired another kidnapper to kidnap the boy and hide him from the investigators. So it's, and it's all the time. It's not, a few bad apples. It's systemic. In the Balkans, they got caught kidnapping children and selling them into sex slavery. So these are the UN peace troops. And you can look this up. This is all extremely well documented. A lot of whistleblowers who have been involved in this have come out. It's atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. And Senator Corker, he's you guys' senator, so that's why I bring him into this. He's also the chairman of the very powerful Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So if you have a telephone, I would call him up. He says that if I heard right now that a UN peacekeeping mission was going to North Chattanooga, which is where my wife is, I would be on the first plane out of here to go home to protect her. So if he would go home to protect his wife, why is he sending our tax dollars to these people to go rape and abuse the wives and the children of other people? Maybe you guys can ask him that. He's your senator, so maybe he can explain to you guys. Yeah, right. So education. Education is, for me, a really big issue because this is really where they think they're going to win the battle. They want the minds of the children, and they've given up on us, right? They know they're not going to brainwash us into supporting this craziness, but they're going for the children, right? So Dr. Sam Blumenfeld and I wrote this book. I have a few copies in the back. If anybody wants to get one afterwards, I'd be happy to give it to you. We have 2 chapters that focus on where this is all going with the education. And put simply, the UN is right now in the process of hijacking control of education all over the world. They have a UN education agency. It's called the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Why does the UN need to be involved in education or science or culture? Well, you can ask them. I don't know. But the first Secretary General of this organization, he said that the goal of UNESCO was political unification in some sort of world government. So they were actually a lot more open back then. One of the pamphlets that they put out in 1949 said that the schools need to be used to combat family attitudes. You can't be transmitting your attitudes and your values to your children. That's the UN's job, to shape the attitudes and the values of your children. Now, today they have programs called Education for Sustainable Development, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. They have Education for World Citizenship, and that's exactly what it sounds like. They're educating your children for world citizenship in a totalitarian state. They have training manuals. They suggest teaching 4-year-olds things that I won't even say in polite company. It's mind-boggling that they want to teach sex education to your 4-year-old children. And there's a very specific agenda to it. It's not just some coincidence. It's not that they think they're being nice by teaching our 4-year-olds things that I won't say in public. It's serious business. And you can find all these manuals on the internet. It's not any kind of secret. You can go to UNESCO's website and read these things. They say, when they're 4, teach them this. When they're 8, teach them how to advocate for safe and legal abortions and other things that I won't even say because they're too disgusting and perverted. But that's the situation we're dealing with. UNESCO also has a World Core curriculum. Some of you have probably heard of the Common Core curriculum, right? That's what they're using in the government schools today here in America. Well, UNESCO has a World Core curriculum. They have for some time. The similarities in the name are not a coincidence. This World Core curriculum was developed by Robert Mueller. He was an Undersecretary General of the UN, and he was a self-described disciple of Alice Bailey. He actually dedicated this World Core curriculum to Alice Bailey. Alice Bailey, for those of you who don't know, and I encourage you to look up this woman too, my goodness. She founded the Lucifer Publishing Company. They've changed the name since then. Now it's called the Lucius Trust. You can read her books, and I don't encourage you to buy them. The last thing they need is more money, but maybe go to the library and check one out. They've got Education in the New Age. And this woman, she said that these spirit masters, these ascended masters, would come over her and take over her body and write these books for her. So, anybody who reads their Bible knows exactly what we're talking about here, right? These aren't ascended spirit masters. This is some very bizarre stuff going on. And this is the person to whom these World Core curriculum standards are dedicated. And they want this in every school on the planet, and they tell you that right on UNESCO's webpage. So this is serious stuff here. The World Core curriculum has to teach the child to see him or herself as a part of the greater whole, right? This language should probably sound familiar. It sounds like Cuba, Zimbabwe, North Korea, other countries where they believe in collectivism. The current head of UNESCO, and this is a wild story, Irina Bokova. She is an actual Bulgarian communist who served the People's Republic of Bulgaria. Her father was a member of the Politburo and the chief propagandist for the Bulgarian Communist Party. Conservative estimates say that this regime murdered 222,000 people. Bulgaria has about 7 million, so that's a big part of the population. They tortured a lot more, especially Christians, anyone who spoke out against communism, big problems. So, of course, they put her in charge of UNESCO, and they were planning to make her the next Secretary General of the United Nations. You won't hear about it in the news, but it's thanks to a campaign run by the New American that she has formally had her name withdrawn by the Bulgarian government after being promoted by all the establishment media as the front runner to lead the UN. So the New American and the John Birch Society have done a lot of good. You won't hear about it from the media, but we did manage to expose this woman, and her nomination was officially withdrawn very recently. So UNESCO, more on UNESCO. Arne Duncan, he was Obama's education secretary for 7 years, U.S. Secretary of Education, and he says UNESCO is his global partner. You can go right on the Department of Education website and you can read his speeches to UNESCO. It's his global partner in creating green global citizens, and he says education is a weapon to change the world, right? And UNESCO is his global partner in cradle-to-career education reform. So with UNESCO as his partner, they have big plans, right? It's a weapon. They just recently, in June, had a global action plan at the United Nations in Korea, and they decided that education has to promote integrated development of the whole person, including the formation of ethics, values, and spirituality. You know, here we thought that was the job of parents and churches to do that, but nope, the UN thinks it's their job. Global citizenship has to be incorporated into curricula worldwide, so all the kids need to be taught that they're global citizens, and you know, your silly parents and your grandparents were in love with their country. That's primitive stuff. Children need to understand their responsibilities to, quote, protect the planet and promote what the UN calls common good. And, you know, every dictator in all of history has said they were acting for the common good, right? How many times have we heard that before the massacres and the concentration camps and so on? And here, sustainable development. You know, this is just scratching the surface here, but this is right from the UN's website, right from UNESCO. Their UN Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit, and we talk about this a good deal in the book, where this is all going. But they say right on the UN's website, you can go to Google, type this in, and you'll find it right away. It says, generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So they're telling you in black and white language that your educated children are a problem for this vision of sustainable development. So they want uneducated minions who you know, will be able to do what they're told, and that's about it. And again, this is right on their website. I encourage everyone to go to Google, type this in, you'll find it right away. So this is this could be its own presentation. I've only chosen one slide out of here because I think this is just so devastating here. But the UN is trying to tell us that global warming is going to kill us all and we need to pay a global carbon tax. They just had this big meeting in Paris. Actually, I was fortunate enough to go there for the New American magazine. It was a bizarre experience. I've been to a few of these now. But this graph, I think, really is devastating. It demolishes the theory. And so, you know, I could talk about this for hours, but this graph here, I think, shows you everything you need to know. The red and the green line, or the blue and the green lines, represent what temperatures have actually done in the real world based on the satellite data, based on the weather balloon data. The red is the average of the UN's models. Every single UN model for the global warming predicted increased and accelerated warming, some more than others. The average is this red line here. And if their theory was correct, this idea that more CO2 in the atmosphere, presumably put there by humans, causes global warming, well then their computer models would have been correct. But they're not. Here you can see what happened in the real world. There you can see what they predicted. So their theory is wrong. It's actually that simple. And I've interviewed dozens of people on the UN's global warming body, the UNFCCC and the UNIPCC. So these are scientists, you know, some of the most respected scientists in the world, who've resigned in disgust. They said, this is not a scientific body, this is a fraud. They have their predetermined conclusions, and then they manipulate the science to fit their conclusions. And the conclusion is, humans are bad, you breathe toxic poison that needs to be taxed and regulated, and carbon dioxide is actually the gas that you exhale. I'm not being facetious, I'm not using hyperbole. Every time you take a breath, you release carbon dioxide. And they're telling you that this is deadly pollution that needs to be taxed and regulated by the United Nations. Every activity you do releases CO2. Sitting on the couch, turning on a light switch, getting in your car, there's nothing you do that does not release CO2. So if we gave the UN the authority to control CO2, that would be the end. There's nothing they could not control. And that's why they're pushing this theory so hard, even though people don't believe it, even though it's been discredited by all the observable evidence, and even though it's just absolutely absurd. They're pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and they came up with this Paris Agreement. They're not going to present it to the U.S. Senate for ratification. They're calling it an executive agreement instead of a treaty. So, you know, we could go on and on and on about this, but check out the New American if you're interested. It's mind-boggling. And I should say, you know, a caveat here, don't believe anything that I'm saying just because I'm saying it. I really encourage everyone to go look at the primary source documents, do the research yourself, because I realize a lot of this stuff just sounds outrageous. You know, how could that even be true? Alex must be crazy. But I'm not. You can find the documents yourself, and I encourage you to do that so that you don't have to take my word for it. So this is from this magazine cover. That's what we put together after the Paris conference, the UN Paris conference. And that's some of the protesters we saw there. They're very open about this. They're not talking about climate change. They're talking about system change. They want system change, right? And by system change, they mean get rid of free markets, get rid of freedom, and substitute it with this UN centrally planned economy. So the real agenda actually was laid out a long time ago, among other places, by the Club of Rome. This is a group of really the top globalists and communists, you know, Mikhail Gorbachev, former dictator of the Soviet Union, Al Gore, these types of people. They came together, and in 1991 they put out this report that says the real enemy is humanity itself. So we're the enemy, right? And they said this openly in their report. That, you know, communism is gone. Now we can't justify all the craziness anymore. So now we need to use humanity as the enemy. And of course, communism didn't go anywhere. It just morphed and changed its colors, and you know, it's still there. But now humanity is officially the enemy, right? We have part of the real agenda is, of course, economic control, right? Here's UNFCCC chief. Actually, she just stepped down earlier this year. But Christiana Figueres, she was the one who ran the COP21. Really weird lady. In 2012 in Cancun, she opened the meeting with a prayer to Ixchel, which is the Mayan goddess of war, human sacrifice, and cannibalism. She said, "May Ixchel guide us while we put it." I kid you not. It's absurd, but it is what it is. And she said here in Qatar that it must be understood that what's occurring here in the whole climate change process is a complete transformation of the economic structure of the world. So, you know, they told us the truth. We can't say they lied. There it is in black and white. They told us what's going on here, a complete transformation of the economic structure of the world. And they don't mean toward more freedom, of course. And if all activities produce CO2, then all activities need to be regulated. Here's another UN guy telling us the real agenda. His name is Otmar Edenhofer. He was a co-chair of one of the IPCC working groups. And he says, we must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. You have to free yourself from the illusion that this has anything to do with environmental policy. This is about redistributing wealth. And when they say redistributing wealth, they want you to think that they're going to go take money from mean billionaires who are just rolling in money. They're not. It's your wealth they're coming after. It's our wealth they're coming after. And they're not going to give it to poor people. They're going to give it to the United Nations, and they're going to give it to the dictators who have made most of humanity poor. So that's what they mean with wealth redistribution, right? And again, they told us that they were doing it, so we can't accuse them of lying in this case, at least. And of course, they want to get rid of liberty, right? This same Figueres lady, she came out in an interview in Bloomberg, and she said communist China is doing it right on climate change. And actually, I was at one of these UN summits in Copenhagen in Denmark in 2009 with Bill Jasper, who I know has spoken here to you guys. And it was like being in an alternate reality. The communist Chinese delegation said, hey, we're doing really good at reducing our carbon emissions. We have you know, these forced abortions and this population control policy. People can only have one kid. And so we're doing really good at reducing our carbon emissions. And people were kind of like, that's weird. You know? Stop talking about it. But that's what they said in Copenhagen. It's crazy, crazy stuff. And they want speech controls, right? They're going after people who point out what a fraud all this is. And they're doing it in the U.S. too. There's a coalition of attorneys general for clean power, I think they call themselves. And they're literally going after nonprofit organizations and people who expose this farce that is the global warming theory. And so that's their agenda. Here's one of the posters I found at one of the UN summits. This one was down in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. Sustainable Development Summit, right? And this poster was all over, and it's going to be forever burned into my mind. You see the sick Earth here. He's got the thermometer, right, and he's not feeling good. And then the doctor comes and he says, you have humans. That's the problem. If we could just get, so humans are the disease, right? And what do you do with a disease? You eradicate it, right? So, you know, it's sick, but this is what passes for normal at these conferences. People don't even blink an eye that humans are portrayed as a disease. It's, you know, I don't even know what to tell you. It speaks for itself. The chairman of this summit, believe it or not, Chinese communist. His name was Shah Zakung, really weird guy. He's talked before about how much he hates America. He gave an award to one of the generals who massacred the students at Tiananmen Square. Really weird guy. And so, of course, you put him in charge of the summit to decide the future of human sustainability, right? And they admit very openly that reducing the population of humans is a key element of this sustainability agenda. You know, they put the reports out on their website. Go to the UN Population Fund. They say, oh, there's too many people in Kenya. There's too many people in Malaysia. There's too many people here. We need to get rid of these many people. So they're pretty open about it, right? And actually, they infest Washington, D.C. as well. Here is John Holdren. He's Obama's science czar, has been from day one. And he wrote a book, 1977, called Eco-Science. Again, don't buy it, please. These guys don't need more money. Just go down to your library and pick it up. And the stuff he says in this book speaks for itself. He says, women could be forced to abort their pregnancies whether they wanted to or not. That's his words, right from there. And he actually said this would be compliant with our Constitution, which is, of course, absurd. He proposed putting sterilizing agents in the water supply to sterilize us, and then only the select few would get the antidote if they had government permission to have children. Single mothers could have their children seized from them against their will. People who contribute to social deterioration can be required by law to exercise reproductive responsibility, right? This sounds a lot like Margaret Sanger and the eugenicists of 80 years ago. This crazy quackery, but you know, there you have it right there. And he also called for a transnational planetary regime. And those are his words, planetary regime, that would have an armed force that would control the resources of the world. So who else to make the science czar in the Obama administration than this guy, right? It's crazy. So it's not just a problem for other countries, it's here in America also. Here's Maurice Strong. He just died, I think, last year in communist China. He had to run away because he was in trouble for embezzlement. But he defined sustainability. My colleague Bill Jasper was down in Rio 20 years ago, and this is where we got this quote from. He said, current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, air conditioning, these are not sustainable, right? So we'll go back to living in huts, and that'll be sustainable after most of us are gone, right? So that's their agenda, and they're pretty clear about it. Again, we can't accuse them of lying. They told us what they're doing. And then Agenda 2030, that's the new one, right? We had Agenda 21 for a long time. I think a lot of you guys know about that. Agenda 2030 is kind of the next phase, right? It's the agenda for the next 15 years. All the governments and dictators of the world endorsed this at the UN last year. Obama said it was great. It's not a treaty, though. Senate won't get to approve this. We're just going to ratify it as an executive agreement. But we'll take a few quotes. I encourage everybody to read this whole document themselves, you know, from start to finish. It's not even that long, so you know, anybody can read this. And what it is basically is a roadmap to totalitarian global government. And they don't even really bother to hide it that much anymore. The slogans, transforming our world, and nobody's going to be left behind. And they emphasize this over and over again. Nobody is going to be left behind. You cannot run to the woods. There's no escaping this, right? So if you think I'm going to build a bunker and I'm going to save a lot of food, that's not going to work. Nobody is going to be left behind. And they told us that. So either we win or we lose. If we lose, this is what's coming. There's no escaping it. Climate change, CO2, is a big deal for this Agenda 2030. They claim it's going to heal Mother Earth, right? Mother Earth, isn't that nice? The Islamic and the communist dictators love it. Robert Mugabe stood up at the UN and he said, this is wonderful. This is going to lead to a brave new world of prosperity for everyone, right? Robert Mugabe is, of course, the genocidal maniac Marxist who runs Zimbabwe, or I should say who ran it into the ground. No Senate ratification again, and it's going to cost trillions. The latest estimate I saw, official estimate, this came out in Reuters, $172 trillion. And of course, we're going to pay for it, right? So there you go. Here's some quotes from there. Goal number 10 says the UN, the national governments, and every person on earth has to reduce inequality within and among countries. So national socialism is no longer enough. Now we need international socialism, of course, administered by the UN, right? To do this is only possible if wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. And that sounds nice until you realize that that's the same rhetoric that Karl Marx used and that Adolf Hitler used and that Chairman Mao used and that Stalin used, and over and over and over again, right? We've seen this. We know where it leads: death, starvation, terror, torture, etc. Nothing good comes out of this, right? By 2030, we need to ensure that all men and women, in particular poor and vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources. Well, if everyone has equal rights to economic resources, what does that mean for our private property? Our private property is economic resources. If everyone has equal rights to my economic resources, I don't have private property anymore, do I? We commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. How are you going to make fundamental changes in the way societies produce and consume goods and services unless you control the way society produces and consumes goods and services? If you want to see how well that works out, Cuba's not all that far from here. It's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. You can see how well that works. It doesn't work well at all. The average salary is about $10 to $20 a month there. It's pitiful, right? We're going to achieve universal health care, right? Lenin thought that was a great idea, the capstone of socialism, right? The government will provide our health care. And vaccines for everyone, universal mental health for everyone, right? And increasingly they're using this mental health to say that if you disagree with them, you have a mental problem, right? And we're going to be seeing much, much more of that. It's not a new thing, right? The Soviets pioneered the idea that if you disagree with them, then you're mentally ill. And we're going to be seeing much more of that. And of course, sexual and reproductive health care services for everyone. And they've told us a million times what they mean when they say that. They mean abortion, right? So abortion's for everyone. They openly tell you that they're coming for your children. They don't even bother to hide it. These are direct quotes from the document. They say children are critical agents of change. Did you know your kids were critical agents of change? Now you do. And they will find in the new goals a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world as defined by the United Nations, right? And they'll make sure of that through the educational system. By 2030, they say, they need to ensure that all learners, so that includes your kids and your grandkids and your nephews and your nieces, acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. So, you know, what more can I say, right? They talk about human rights, gender equality. We'll get into some of those things in a minute. They sound nice. They're not nice. So lots more on that. Refugee crisis. We could, again, talk about this for a long time. It's a crucial component of this. The UN is actually running it all, believe it or not. The UN is choosing what refugees, so-called, are going to be sent to the United States, and they have an agency that's in charge of that. But just a few quick points on this, and I think it'll be clear why I bring it up. First of all, you have to realize that the people who are promoting all this craziness are the people who destroyed the countries that these people are fleeing from in the first place. Who destroyed Libya? Who destroyed Syria? Who destroyed Iraq? The same globalists who are now inviting all of these guys into our countries at taxpayer expense. So they're not humanitarian. If I burn down your house and then invite you into my neighbor's house and tell your neighbor that he needs to pay for you, that's not humanitarian, right? That's criminal. You would call the police and say this is an arsonist. You know, and yet that's exactly what we're expected to believe here, that this is somehow humanitarian, to destroy these people's countries, to bomb their countries, and then invite them into yours at taxpayer expense. It's not humanitarian. And here we have in their own words, right? You'll get the agenda right from the horse's mouth. This is the UN Migration Czar. I forget his full title. It's a UN Special Representative on International Migration or something. Former chairman of Goldman Sachs, former member of the Bilderberg Steering Committee. Some of you, that probably means something. Bilderberg's a kind of secretive organization. But anyways, he says he's going to ask governments to cooperate and recognize that sovereignty is an illusion. Sovereignty is an absolute illusion that has to be put behind us. So no more independent nations, no more self-government. This is all an illusion that needs to be put behind us. The days of hiding behind borders and fences are long gone, and we have to work together and cooperate together to make a better world. Isn't that nice that the Bilderbergers and the Goldman Sachs and the UN want a better world? And we have to get rid of these shibboleths, taking on some of the historic memories and images of our own country. So own country, forget all that old primitive stuff. That's for losers. The new world is, you know, this new world order where we're all just one and the UN runs things for us. George Soros, right, everybody's favorite billionaire. He says that our plan treats the protection of refugees as the objective and national borders as the obstacle. So our borders are the obstacle to their agenda. And he told us this. He wrote this in a column that was published in newspapers all over the world. Borders are an obstacle. What do you do with obstacles? You get rid of them, right? You go around them. Not everybody has been duped by this, right? There's a few people who have come out and said what's really going on here, so you don't have to take my word for it. Here's the Prime Minister of Hungary. He says that this is, his words, a treasonous conspiracy that endangers our way of life, our culture, our customs, and our Christian traditions. It's a pre-planned, orchestrated operation, a mass of people directed towards us. So, you know, he has figured out what's happening here, right? He says that the goal here is to reshape the religious and cultural landscape of Europe, and of course the United States too, but he's concerned with Europe because he's in Hungary. And he says that thereby they're going to eliminate the last barrier to internationalism, or globalism, if you will, and that is, of course, the nation states. So they're going to undermine Christianity, Western civilization, the nation states, on the road toward this one world order, right? So some of the more recent rhetoric from these guys, the UN Secretary General in recent months, it started about 8 months ago, maybe a year ago, sorry. He started calling the UN the Parliament of Humanity. And those are his words, and he keeps repeating it over and over again. So it wasn't like an oversight, right? What is a parliament? It's a sovereign legislative body with the authority to make laws. So he's saying, the head of the UN is saying that he leads a sovereign legislative body with the authority to make laws. So, you know, who sits in this legislative assembly? Well, the representatives of Raul Castro, the representatives of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, the representatives of Robert Mugabe, you know, bloodthirsty maniacs. Even the establishment, the Freedom House, which is you know, an establishment organization, they say that 55% of the member governments of the United Nations are unfree. So, you know, if you use their standards, already a majority of the governments in this legislative body, this Parliament of Humanity, are unfree. If you use objective standards, we're talking 80, 90% of these governments are unfree. And they claim they have the authority now to make laws over us, right? What happens if we don't like the laws? Can we recall our congressman? Right? No, right? So this is a big deal. The G77 plus Communist China, and don't let the name mislead you, it's actually 134 governments. It's a coalition of, you know, third world communist dictators, Islamic dictators. You know, there's a few elected governments among them, but it's a giant bloc, right? I mean, they dominate the General Assembly. There's like 193 members there. This bloc has 134. What they want, they get. They came out with an interesting document last year. They met in Bolivia, and the document was, I kid you not, toward a new world order to live well. And in this document, they said that they want the UN General Assembly to be transformed into an emblem of global sovereignty. Their words, not mine, and you should read this. I mean, they talk about the UN needs to be in charge of fighting terrorism, doing education, controlling economics, redistributing wealth. And of course, they mean your wealth, you know, not anybody else's. And again, I mentioned this earlier on, the UN Agenda 2030, now they're calling it the Declaration of Interdependence for We the Peoples. Right? That language should sound familiar. We had a Declaration of Independence for We the People, right? And so this is a new thing, and they didn't just pull this out of a hat, right? They know what they're talking about, they know what they're saying, they know what they're doing. This is planned. And on the 70th anniversary of the UN, so this was about a year ago, the slogan, Strong UN, Better World, and they lit up monuments all over the world in blue. And they said, all over the place, Strong UN, Better World, right? Isn't that nice? So let's see if a strong UN would really mean a better world. Let's compare. I just took a few pieces out of here. Just I think it illustrates the point I want to make. The U.S. Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator. So God gave us our rights, right? Unalienable rights. And if God gave us our rights, nobody can take them away from us. Among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? And they say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So we have a government to protect the rights that God gave us. This is an amazing statement here. Now compare that to the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? And this is what they're pushing. They say this trumps everything. Human rights law applies everywhere, in all places, and if you disagree, you need to go to jail, literally. And this assumes that rights are, first of all, bestowed by governments and international treaties like this UN Declaration of Human Rights. There is no God here, right? They don't say God gave you these rights and governments protect them. They say we give you these rights because we're nice guys. Now, Article 29 claims that rights can be limited by law under the guise of pretty much anything, right? They say public order, general welfare, anything that a dictator could think of, they can limit your rights. In the same article, they say that everyone has duties to their community. And they also say that rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. And they mean exactly what they say. You cannot use your fake rights contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So our First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. Can you imagine if it said Congress shall make no law unless Congress doesn't like what you have to say? In that case, then they can make a law. That's exactly what they're saying here, except it's not even Congress, because at least Congress we elect, right? These guys, we don't have any say in what they do. So here's just a tiny handful of the attacks. This is I could go on for hours about this because I write about it all the time. They come out, the UN Human Rights Council, right, dominated by dictatorships. It's like a caricature of itself. The Castro, the socialist regime in Venezuela, communist China. Who else is on there? Sudan almost got on there. The genocidal guy that the ICC says is committing genocide. Who else is on there? So many communist dictatorships, the Vietnam dictatorship, all these communist dictatorships are on this Human Rights Council, and they get together and they say, oh, you guys are so good at human rights. Oh, Cuba, you guys are awesome at human rights. America, oh man, are you guys in trouble? You guys let people do hate speech because, you know, whatever. So they say that under human rights, we need to outlaw speech that they don't approve of. You know, right now they start with hate speech, which is increasingly meaning anything that the politicians and the establishment hates, right? In some countries, even in Europe now, they're throwing pastors in jail. In Sweden, where I spent most of the last 8 years living, they threw a pastor in jail for quoting from Scripture that homosexuality is a sin. You're not allowed to say that anymore. It's hate speech. And you'll go to jail if you say it. In Britain, they're doing the same thing. Winston Churchill, you know, the famous British politician, World War II, he had some comments about Islam. He wasn't a big fan of the Islamic religion. A British politician quoted Winston Churchill's remarks about Islam in public, and he was hauled off to jail for hate speech. Right? So you cannot say the truth anymore. The truth is hate speech. In Sweden, you know, Sweden I always say is 15, 20, maybe 30 years ahead of us. The Justice Ministry investigated the Bible for hate speech. And they concluded that there was hate speech in the Bible. It's just not practical to ban it yet because, you know, some bitter clingers are still really attached to that old book. But they're coming for the Bibles, right? More gun control. They're constantly blabbering about the need for more gun control. Human rights demands more gun control. That's what the UN Human Rights Secretary told us. Zaid Hussein is his name. After the Orlando attack, he came out, they put out an official press release all over the UN website. It came to my email. International human rights law requires robust gun control. The United States government has an obligation to impose robust gun control. They've got the Arms Trade Treaty. They're coming for the guns, right? So our First Amendment protects our right to free speech, our right to freedom of religion. Our Second Amendment protects our right to keep and bear arms. In the UN world, it's upside down, right? The right to be safe from gun violence means we all have to be disarmed, right? The right to be not offended by hate speech means we have to give up our religion and our speech. And that is where this is all going. They say we have to ignore due process protections. So now almost every time something happens in the United States, the UN has something to say about it. Somebody gets shot, something here happens, they say, oh, the government must do this and that. You know, they don't even wait for an actual investigation, much less a trial with a jury and actual, you know, due process to take place. We have this thing where we're all innocent until we're proven guilty. Not in UN speak. They come out and they say, yo, you must do this, you must do that, this person is guilty. This happened a lot with the self-defense laws, right? The stand your ground law, when that was a controversy. You had every UN bureaucrat coming out and saying that stand your ground is against human rights and that we need to get rid of all these guns and otherwise we're not complying with UN human rights treaties. We need to eliminate constitutional limitations on the federal government. They say the U.S. government joined the UN, and so the U.S. government must do this, must do that, must do that. And of course, the U.S. government doesn't have the authority to do those things. You know, we delegated a handful of authorities to the federal government in the Constitution. If it's not in there, they can't do it. But the UN says they must do it because of these UN treaties. Some of the things that they say we need to ban spanking of children. You can no longer spank your children. That's a human rights violation, and if you do it, you need to go to jail. We need to legalize abortion. Well, they've already done that here with the fraudulent Supreme Court decision, but they lecture the Latin American countries all the time. You can't ban the murder of children. How dare you? That's against human rights. You know, whose human rights? Certainly not the babies, right? They want to regulate private schools. The UN Human Rights Commission said it's not okay to have unregulated private schools. The government needs to step in because of human rights. And actually, if you read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it tells you right there, all education must promote the UN agenda. It tells you in Article 16 that it must promote the UN's vision of human rights. It must promote, and we already discussed that, right? It's quite problematic. They've even started lecturing countries about not providing enough welfare. They said in Canada, they said, you guys aren't giving enough welfare. In Britain, they said, you guys aren't giving welfare recipients big enough houses. Human rights says you have to give them bigger houses with guest bedrooms in case they have guests. And this is serious stuff. They're putting out these reports. And then Cuba, oh, you guys are doing great. Saudi Arabia, beheading Christians. Oh, you guys are doing great. Wonderful human rights record over in Saudi Arabia, which, of course, sits on the UN Human Rights Council. So the end goal of all this, and I'm really having to speed through it, and I could talk on this for hours. But the end goal really is very simply a totalitarian world system. They call it the New World Order a lot. If you listen to their speeches, George Bush in 1991 went on TV, said the purpose of me invading Iraq under the UN is to create a new world order. And he told us what the New World Order was, right? It's a world where the UN peacekeeping forces can implement the vision of the UN's founders, who we went over at the beginning, right? Stalin, Alger Hiss, these types of people. Why would we want UN peacekeeping forces implementing this totalitarian vision? Well, I don't know. Ask George Bush. So the strategy, they've given us this too, is divide the world up into these regional governments, right? The European Union is obviously the most obvious example. They're working on building a Middle East Union. They're working on building a North American Union with NAFTA as the foundation. They have an African Union with its own military, its own parliament, its own court. They have the Union of South American States with all of those things. And this is coming to every corner of the globe. Southeast Asia has ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and no country will be allowed to be left out of these things. That's why they freaked out about the Brexit, right? And they're doing everything they can to prevent the British from actually leaving the European Union. Then they'll have to stick them in another regional government. They want a global currency, they want a global education system, et cetera, et cetera. And here's what Henry Kissinger told us. I call him Henry New World Order Kissinger. He released a book in 2014, World Order. And whenever you hear world order, you can just substitute the word order for government, and you get a picture of what they're talking about. And he says, the contemporary quest for world order will require a coherent strategy to establish a concept of order within the various regions, and then to relate these regional orders to one another. So Putin is building his Eurasian Union, right? He's doing it openly with all the former Soviet states, and then that's supposed to fight against the European Union, and this is a very deliberate strategy. Putin will say, oh, look, the European Union, they're bad. We need to have a Eurasian Union. And then the European Union says, look, Putin's building a Eurasian Union. We need to have a European Union, right? And so it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. It's quite ridiculous. And George Soros told us a lot about where this new world order is going. He says, I think you need a new world order, and that China has to be a part of the process of creating it. They have to buy in, and they have to own it in the same way that the United States owns the current order. And that's what they're working on, right? I was talking earlier with somebody. The UN agency that wants to take over the internet now that Obama gave it away is the International Telecommunications Union, and this agency happens to be led by a Chinese communist. And the Korean press caught up to him, and they said, hey, what do you think about censorship? He said, oh, censorship, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. We have different definitions of censorship, so we'll see. It's quite clear where all of this is going, right? But there is a rather simple solution. We do need to get busy because these guys are dead serious. But we can stop it, actually. We can set it back decades. And that is by getting us out of the United Nations. And there's a bill in Congress to do that already. It's H.R. 1205, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, introduced by a congressman from Alabama. I think it has 9 or 10 co-sponsors right now. It needs a whole lot more. But it's a great piece of legislation. It's super simple. It's 4 pages. It would get us out of the UN. It would kick them out of America, right? No more UN headquarters on U.S. soil infested with spies and terrorists and who knows what. No more parade of dictators once a year to go speak at the General Assembly. And it would stop all U.S. funding of the UN. It would sever all of our links with these UN treaties. And it would prohibit U.S. military service under the United Nations. There's little goodie bags before you guys leave that Mitchell put together. There's a great article in there by Jack McManus. It's called Our Un-American Military, and it's about how the U.S. military has been subjugated and coerced into service of the United Nations, right? When our kids sign up for the military, they don't sign up to serve the United Nations, but unfortunately, that's what's happening more and more, right? Obama went into Libya based on a UN resolution under the command of NATO. NATO is a UN subsidiary organization. All of these regional governments are UN subsidiary organizations. So we need to get out of the UN. Momentum is building for this, right? After the Brexit, there was a big uptick in activity. You had Representative Thomas Massey. He came out and he said it's time for an AM exit, went on the radio and gave all the reasons why. That's another thing you'll find in your goodie bag. From Brexit to AM exit, keep the momentum going. All the reasons Thomas Massey gave for getting out of the UN, lots of very good ones. And then he said, in one word, the reason is sovereignty, right? We need national independence to be able to protect our rights. Even Sarah Palin, love her or hate her, whatever, but she's, important figure in our political debate, and she says it's time to get out of this UN, right? The one world government apocalyptic stuff, and it's good that the British decided to leave, and America can learn an encouraging lesson. It's time to dissolve the political bands that connect us to the agendas not in our best interest. May UN shackles be next on the chopping block. So as for solutions, I always tell people we need to pray, right? God, actually, we're going to need his help for this. And the Bible tells us that too, right? If my people shall humble themselves and pray, he will heal our land, right? He tells us that, and that's a promise, and God keeps his promises. We need to educate ourselves, and we need to educate others. We need to educate our children and protect them from being dumbed down with these agendas. We need to not be misled by people who say it's the Jews or it's the Mormons or the Catholics or all this kind of hate. That doesn't accomplish anything. It's useless. It's counterproductive. It goes nowhere. And the John Birch Society, excellent group. Has been around for more than 50 years working on this exact agenda, right? Get us out of the United Nations. We've been working on this from the beginning. And the motto, to bring about less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world, right? So that's a simple motto, and I don't see how you could agree with that unless disagree with that unless you're the United Nations. And they provide educational materials, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The JBS puts out all kinds of great materials. The Freedom Index, you can find out how your congressman is voting. This ranks them according to how they vote constitutionally. Constitutional votes are good. Unconstitutional votes are bad. Captain John Birch was, of course, a missionary to China who was murdered by Chinese communists. He joined military intelligence. And Robert Welch, the founder of the society, said that we need to expose the conspiracy that's at work behind all of this. And some of you are thinking, oh, conspiracy theories, right? We don't need to theorize. Here it is in their own words. Here's David Rockefeller, right, another New World Order guy. Don't buy his book, please. He's got plenty of money, right? He's a super billionaire, but go to the library and pick up his book. It says, some even believe that we, he's talking about his family, are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring, so that's his word, with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. And he says that if that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it. So he's proud of being a conspirator working against the best interests of his own country to promote this one world order. So we don't need to theorize. There's no need for theorizing. They already told us what they're up to. All right, God bless America. Thank you guys so much for coming.